What if a single night changed everything you believed about loyalty, loss, and the secrets small towns keep? When a gentle German shepherd stopped cold before a row of old dolls, Officer Carter Blake never imagined he'd stumble onto a trail of silent cries, missing children, and a mystery woven deep into the heart of Sandpoint, Idaho. As rain fell and hope faded, a dog's instincts would lead him and his grieving partner through locked doors, forgotten houses, and the darkness beneath a lonely warehouse. If you had the chance to answer a stranger's cry for help, would you follow, no matter where it led? The streets of Sandpoint, Idaho, were painted in gold that autumn, maple and birch leaves drifting down in slow, patient spirals, gathering in gentle piles along the curbs. The town breathed with an old wood smoke hush. Each porch was cluttered with pumpkins, the air heavy with the scent of earth and cooling pine. By late evening, Main Street felt abandoned, except for the rare passing headlights or the faint shuffle of a lone figure walking home. Carter Blake liked these quiet nights. He'd grown up under this same canopy of trembling branches and October winds, knew every crack in the sidewalk, every story whispered by the lake at dawn. At 32, he wore his badge lightly, as if it were just another layer of memory, a way to keep the town safe, yes, but also to remind himself that he still belonged to it. His cruiser rumbled slow along the curb, heater on low, radio humming static in the background. On the passenger seat, Rowan curled in a tight circle, nose pressed to his tail, one ear always flicked toward the world beyond the glass. Tonight, Carter's mind was elsewhere, an entry he'd left unfinished in his battered notebook, a memory of his father's hands building a wooden kite, the ache that still surprised him when the fire siren blared through town. He tried not to dwell on it. He watched Rowan instead, how the dog's chest rose and fell, how even asleep, he never truly rested. Sandpoint's heart was small and stubborn. 2 diners, a gas station, the steady brick of the police outpost, and Maple and Sons, the old antique shop squeezed between the bakery and a shuttered theater. Carter had always liked the place, if only for the stubbornness of its owner, Mr. Halverson, who insisted on sweeping his steps every morning, rain or shine. The windows were always cluttered with porcelain dolls, toy trains, and faded teddy bears. Sometimes, on slow patrols, Carter would slow down just to peer through the glass, remembering when he and his brother would stare at those same dolls, inventing stories for the ones with missing eyes or painted-on tears. Rowan shifted suddenly, pressing his snout to the window, and gave a soft, throaty sound. Not quite a whine, not quite a growl, something in between, as if he'd caught the scent of a distant storm. Carter glanced over, raising an eyebrow, but Rowan only stood up, pressed a paw against the dashboard, and stared intently through the misted windshield at Maple and Sons. The town was sleeping, but from the antique shop, a thin, irregular sound drifted into the street. Clack, clack, clack. Carter's skin prickled. The shop had been closed for hours. The lights inside had blinked off at 6, as always. But now, in the heavy dark, the display window flickered with an odd, restless shadow, a movement behind the ranks of dolls, as if something was gently jostling the shelf. He parked the cruiser, stepped out into the cold, Rowan padding silently at his side. The dog's posture had changed, no longer sleepy but tense, ears pricked, body low to the ground, tail straight and alert. Carter crouched beside him, palm resting on Rowan's strong back, and listened. The wind picked up, swirling the leaves in small, frantic dances at their feet. The antique shop's front step was slick with dampness, the glass fogged at the edges. Carter leaned in, peering through the window. Inside, the dolls sat in their familiar rows, ceramic faces frozen in porcelain surprise, some with painted mouths curled in faded smiles, others wide-eyed with something that looked like sorrow. Rowan pressed his nose to the bottom of the door and huffed, fogging the glass. Then he froze, muscles taut, eyes locked on the second shelf, where a cluster of old dolls dressed in yellowed lace and velvet seemed slightly disarranged. One doll had toppled, lying awkwardly on her side, glass eyes staring upward. Another's head was cocked at an odd angle, as if straining to hear something the others could not. Carter's heart beat slower, the world narrowing to the sound of Rowan's breathing and the soft tick of the shop's old wall clock, a sound he realized he could hear faintly through the door, though no other noise carried from inside. Then, again, that clack, softer now, as if coming from deeper within the shelves. Rowan's gaze never wavered, his body trembling with a tension Carter recognized from stormy nights, when thunder rolled in from the lake and the air grew heavy with old grief. For a moment, Carter considered calling in, but the thought seemed unnecessary. This was just an old shop, a stray draft, a mouse or the settling of wood. He stood there a long time, letting the cold seep into his bones, letting Rowan's presence steady him. The world felt hollow, expectant. Then, in the reflection of the glass, Carter saw it. The faintest movement, a pale shape passing between the shelves, just beyond the line of dolls. It vanished almost as soon as he registered it. Too quick, too subtle to trust. But it left a chill on the back of his neck that wouldn't leave. Rowan turned to look at Carter, eyes bright and unblinking, as if asking a question that neither of them could answer. The dog pressed his head lightly against Carter's knee, a gesture so small and ordinary that it almost broke the tension. Together, they stood in the hush of Sandpoint's autumn, watched over by hundreds of silent faces in the dark shop window. Somewhere behind those dolls, something had moved. Something that did not want to be seen. The leaves whispered against the door, and the street held its breath. The clicking sound had come from behind the line of old dolls, yet when Carter looked closer, nothing was there. No footprints, no shadows. Who was there? And what, if anything, was trying to be heard? Morning in Sandpoint had always been slow to arrive. Sunlight creeping cautiously over the pine ridges, spilling across rooftops in pale streaks. By the time Carter Blake made his way back to Main Street, the chill had only softened slightly, and a fine mist lingered over the lake. At Maple & Sons, the world seemed unchanged from the night before. Windows layered with dust and old decals, porch still swept clean, a scattering of leaves caught beneath the stoop. But as Carter and Rowan stepped from the cruiser, Mr. Halverson stood waiting in the doorway, a man made older by worry. His hands, usually steady as he arranged his collectibles, fidgeted at the buttons of his faded vest. He glanced down at Rowan, then up at Carter, his eyes pleading in a way words rarely could. "I wouldn't call you out if it wasn't strange," he muttered. "But there's something not right, officer. Someone's been here." Inside, the shop felt colder, less welcoming. The dolls on their shelves seemed to watch in silence. Carter moved carefully past the clutter of clocks, books, and silver-framed photographs. Rowan at his side, nose low, tail still. It was the kind of hush that pressed in on you, the hush of secrets, of words that didn't want to be spoken aloud. Mr. Halverson pointed toward the far wall, where a cluster of boopbe, all in old-fashioned dresses, looked as if they'd been hurriedly rearranged. A few had fallen sideways, one perched dangerously close to the edge of a shelf, its porcelain hand outstretched as if to catch something that would never return. But it was the footprints that caught Carter's breath. A series of faint, nearly perfect ovals dusted into the floorboards near the shelves. Small, delicate, as if left by a barefoot child tiptoeing through dust. They trailed toward a corner of the display, stopping abruptly at the base of the largest cabinet. Rowan's body language shifted, ears flat, low growl rising from his chest. He nosed the cabinet, then scratched lightly at the wood, whimpering under his breath, each sound a soft plea for Carter's attention. It wasn't like Rowan to make a scene. He was a quiet dog, content to observe, to guard, to comfort. But now he seemed restless, almost anxious, as if some invisible thread pulled him closer to whatever lay hidden beneath the display. Carter crouched beside him, pressing a palm to Rowan's back. The dog's muscles quivered, not with fear, but with urgency, an instinct Carter had learned never to ignore. He ran his hand along the edge of the cabinet and tucked just out of sight between two heavy volumes of faded encyclopedias, found a scrap of paper, creased and slightly damp, as if it had been held tight in a sweating palm. He unfolded it. The writing was childish, letters tilting and running together, but clear enough. "Help me. Can you hear?" He read the words twice, 3 times, the world narrowing to the scratch of pencil against paper. There was something smeared across the bottom, dark gray, nearly black, a stain that had bled into the grain of the page. Carter pressed the paper between his fingers, realizing as he did that the mark was not from ink or dirt, but water. Tears, maybe, or rain. Rowan whined, pressing his head insistently against Carter's leg, looking up with eyes that seemed to say, "You see it too, don't you?" Carter placed the note in his pocket and ran a hand over the shelf, fingers trailing across the backs of dolls in their faded dresses. Each face was unique, some chipped, some painted with care, others nearly erased by time and touch. He remembered for a moment the dolls his mother kept in a box in the attic, how he'd been afraid to look at them after his brother died, fearing that the silence in their faces might somehow swallow him whole. Mr. Halverson hovered nearby, wringing his hands. "It wasn't like this yesterday," he whispered. "And that paper, I didn't see it before. I don't even know how a child would have gotten in here. The lock hasn't been changed in years." Carter wanted to say something reassuring, but the words caught in his throat. He knew from experience that sometimes the world left its doors unlocked in ways that had nothing to do with keys. He glanced at Rowan, then at the tracks on the floor. The footprints were already fading, the dust unsettled by the morning air. He kneeled to examine the baseboard. There, a tiny scrape in the wood, as if something small and sharp had been dragged across it. A fingernail, maybe, or the edge of a toy. He let his fingertips linger there, feeling the story in the groove. Rowan licked his hand, a gentle grounding touch. The shop's silence deepened, broken only by the creak of a distant floorboard as someone moved upstairs, a reminder that life went on, even when answers didn't come. Carter stood, surveying the shop with new eyes. What had happened here was more than a prank, more than a stray animal or a gust of wind. He felt the old ache in his chest, the ache of things lost and never truly found. He reached for his notebook, hesitated, then wrote only a single line, Who cries behind the dolls? As he and Rowan prepared to leave, Carter glanced once more at the shelf. There, where the dolls leaned close together, a drop of water glimmered on a porcelain cheek. Maybe it was just the morning dew sneaking through a crack in the window. Maybe it was something else. The note, damp with tears, and the small footprints, signs of a desperate plea for help, remained unanswered. Who left the message, and how had they managed to slip in and out of a locked, forgotten shop? Night comes early in Sandpoint in October. The sun fades behind the mountains. The sky smears itself with bruised lilac and old gold, and the lights along the lakefront blink on one by one, faint and scattered as hope itself. Carter liked to think he was used to the darkness. He'd spent half his life working inside it, knowing it as a kind of companion, a silence that listened but never answered. He sat at the kitchen table that night, hands folded around a mug gone cold, the faint scratch of his pen moving across the pages of his battered notebook. Each night, he wrote down a few lines. Stray thoughts, what he'd seen on patrol, a memory that lingered longer than it should have. The habit steadied him. Some people prayed. Carter wrote. Rowan lay curled at his feet, tail sweeping slow across the linoleum. The dog's breathing was steady, but he kept lifting his head, ears flicking at every creak or distant engine. Carter watched him for a while, pen poised but unmoving. Rowan was usually calm in the evenings, a gentle shadow beneath the table. But tonight there was a restlessness in him, something Carter recognized, deep and wordless. After a while, Rowan stood, padded over to the window, and stared out into the darkness. His reflection floated ghost-like in the glass, the faint outline of his scarred ear and the silver tracing along his back. Carter joined him, pressing a palm to the cold pane. The street outside was empty, the world quiet except for the soft shuffle of leaves in the gutter. The image tugged Carter backward in time, a damp November morning years ago when he'd found Rowan trembling in the half-light of a ruined house at the edge of town. The dog had been so thin his ribs showed through his coat, eyes wide and wild as he huddled among broken bottles and scraps of newspaper. Carter had crouched low, speaking in a voice made gentle by grief, holding out his hand for long minutes before Rowan dared inch closer. Even now, Carter remembered the moment Rowan pressed his battered head against his fingers, the slight shiver that ran through them both. It was not love at first sight. It was something quieter. A question asked and tentatively answered. A contract between two beings who knew what it was to be left behind. Tonight, as the hours dragged slow and the wind battered at the eaves, Carter felt the old ache in his chest, the hollow where his brother's laughter used to live, the space that never quite filled in, no matter how many times he told himself he'd done all he could. Rowan whined softly, then made his way back to Carter's side, nudging his head beneath Carter's hand. Carter scratched behind Rowan's ears, fingers finding the familiar furrow of the scar. For a moment, they stayed like that. One man, one dog, bound by what they'd lost, steady in what they'd found together. On impulse, Carter knelt to examine Rowan's neck, running his fingers through the thick ruff. That's when he found it. A tiny, fresh scratch, barely scabbed, just below Rowan's left ear. He frowned, surprised. It hadn't been there this morning, and Rowan hadn't made a sound of pain during their rounds. Carter thought back. When had Rowan been out of sight? Only at the antique shop, when he'd pressed close to the bottom shelf, desperate to get behind the line of dolls. Carter sat back on his heels, heart beating slow and heavy. He wondered, was Rowan only anxious because of the strange energy in the shop? Or had something else happened? Had something, reached out in the dark, tried to hold Rowan back, or draw him in? He rose and pulled his notebook closer, scribbling a line in the margin. Rowan's scratch. What did you find, boy? The question hung in the air, unanswered. Rowan yawned, settling again at Carter's feet. But his eyes never quite closed. The house seemed to breathe with them, every creak and sigh of the old floorboards, every distant echo from the lake. Carter felt Rowan's weight against his boots, a silent reassurance that he was not as alone as he sometimes felt. He returned to the window and looked out again, his gaze drawn across the street to the dim glow of Maple and Sons. Somewhere in that darkness, behind glass and dust and silent dolls, was a story unfinished, a plea for help that hadn't reached the right ears, a sadness that refused to be boxed away. Rowan lifted his head once more, watching Carter, waiting. There was trust in his eyes, and something else, an old pain that mirrored Carter's own. It was not lost on Carter how much of his life had been shaped by things left unsaid. The words caught behind his father's smile, the apology he'd never spoken to his brother, the questions he'd never dared to ask the world. Maybe that was why he listened so carefully now, to dogs, to children, to the hush behind closed doors. He wrote again in his notebook, softer this time. Not all ghosts are afraid of the dark. Some just want to be seen. As night folded itself around the little house, Carter sat with Rowan and the silence between them, not needing answers, only the comfort of presence. But he could not shake the feeling that Rowan had brought something back from the shop. A warning, perhaps, or an invitation. And in the quiet, Carter promised himself, tomorrow they would return, and this time he would listen even more closely. Carter discovers a fresh scratch on Rowan's neck, a sign that something or someone had reached out to the dog at the shop. Was Rowan merely anxious, or had he sensed and touched something that waited, grieving, behind the dolls? Sandpoint's morning was a hush of clouds and wet leaves. Carter walked the short distance from his house to Main Street with Rowan at his heel, the leash slack between them. He preferred these hours before the world grew busy, when the lake was a sheet of cold silver and the world felt fragile, as if one careless word might wake the ghosts that drifted just beneath its surface. Maple and Sons stood in the faint drizzle, windows still streaked from last night's rain. Carter paused at the door, glancing up at the faded sign, the letters just beginning to peel, and caught his reflection. Tired eyes, hair that never quite lay flat. Rowan waiting patiently at his side. Mr. Halverson greeted them at the threshold, voice lower than usual, as if the worry from yesterday still clung to his bones. Morning, officer. Back so soon? Carter only nodded, not wanting to crowd the silence. Inside, the air was thick with the scent of old paper and lavender sachets gone stale. Carter moved slowly past the rows of shelves, the steady tick of the grandfather clock marking each moment. Rowan padded beside him, ears up, every muscle taut. He paused at the far end of the counter, nose twitching. There, half hidden by a pile of empty hat boxes and a battered carousel horse, was a narrow wooden door, worn, the paint chipped and curling like dry bark. Carter remembered this door from childhood. It had always been locked, a storeroom or closet, a place where unwanted things were left to gather dust. He reached for the handle, surprised to find it loose in his hand. He pressed gently, and the door gave a low, reluctant groan, swinging open a few inches before catching on something inside. Rowan stiffened, his body suddenly alert, tail lifted but unmoving. He pressed his nose into the gap, snuffling hard, then let out a single, sharp bark that seemed to hang in the small room like a question. Mr. Halverson flinched, worry flashing across his face. "That door hasn't been opened in 10 years, at least," he whispered. "Not since my wife passed." Carter crouched and peered through the narrow gap. Inside was darkness layered on darkness, boxes stacked high, forgotten trunks, the detritus of decades. The air smelled of mildew and time. He tried the light switch, but nothing happened. Rowan shoved closer, breath coming quick, paws scraping at the dusty boards. Carter could see just enough to make out a narrow path winding through the clutter, leading toward the back wall where a large wooden crate sat under a tarp. The sense of unease grew stronger. Carter called for a flashlight, which Mr. Halverson fetched from behind the counter, hands shaking. The beam cut through the gloom, revealing layers of cobwebs, a child's bike with faded streamers, a stack of yellowing newspapers tied with twine. Rowan pulled free from Carter's gentle grip, pressing forward until his nose touched the crate. He let out a low whine and scratched insistently at the wood, his nails sending up tiny clouds of dust. Carter kneeled beside him, running a hand along the lid. There was something deeply unsettling about the way the crate seemed to dominate the space, as if everything else had been shoved aside to make room for it. Its surface was scored with old scratches, the corners battered from years of moving. He pressed an ear to the wood, half expecting to hear the steady thump of a mouse or the rattle of some small animal trapped inside. Instead, there was only stillness. Yet Rowan would not be moved. He pressed his chest to the floor, tail tucked, nose pressed tight to the edge, as if the crate itself was breathing sadness. Carter could feel the dog's anxiety through the leash, a trembling that traveled up his arm and settled in his chest. He reached for the crowbar Mr. Halverson offered him, sliding it carefully under the edge. The lid groaned, then popped free, a cloud of dust rising in the pale flashlight glow. Inside was a tangle of old fabric, broken doll limbs, a faded red scarf, a wooden train missing its wheels. But underneath it all, barely visible, was a single child's shoe, impossibly small, its laces tied in a neat bow. Rowan whimpered, pawing at the shoe, his eyes wide and wet. Carter lifted it gently, turning it over in his hands. The name Emily was written inside in a childish scrawl. He felt a shiver move through him, some echo of grief and hope tangled together. Mr. Halverson watched from the doorway, silent as a prayer. "There were always stories, you know," he said at last, "of children hiding back here during storms, of lost things that never quite made it home." Carter nodded, heart heavy. He could feel the presence of the past pressing in, the weight of what had been left unsaid, what had been locked away. He turned to Rowan, who sat, unmoving, by the crate, his breathing fast but steady, as if waiting for the world to catch up to the secret he'd uncovered. The storeroom door, once stubbornly shut, now stood open, the light from the shop spilling in and illuminating all the dust motes that danced in its wake. Carter crouched beside Rowan, the shoe in one hand, the other resting on the dog's back. At the end of the narrow passage, Rowan paused insistently at an old, dust-covered crate. Inside, Carter finds a child's shoe with the name Emily written inside, untouched for years. What happened to Emily? And what more lies hidden in the darkness beyond the storeroom door? The lid of the crate rested askew, the smell of old cedar and dust hanging in the air. Carter crouched low, letting the beam of the flashlight travel slowly over the jumbled contents. Fractured porcelain faces, a tangle of faded yarn hair, scraps of velvet and linen dresses that had once been bright and hopeful, now dulled by time and neglect. There were glass eyes gleaming at odd angles, hands poised in frozen gestures, reminders that someone long ago had tried to give each of these broken dolls a personality, a name, a place in the world. But it was the child's shoe that Carter could not look away from. He turned it gently in his hand, feeling the soft edges worn by many steps. Emily, written inside with a blue marker, the letters round and uneven, hopeful, a child's careful attempt to stake a claim on something easily lost. Rowan pressed close, nose quivering. He inhaled deeply, then sneezed, shaking dust from his muzzle. Carter set the shoe down, ruffled the dog's fur, and tried to ignore the tightness in his own chest. There was something about the stillness of the place, the half-light and the mustiness, that made him feel like a trespasser, an outsider to an old sorrow. The silence inside the storeroom pressed in on them, broken only by the far-off tick of the grandfather clock and the occasional gentle huff from Rowan. Carter began lifting items out of the crate, each one light as air yet heavy with story. A doll's arm with a lacy cuff, a scarf unraveling at the edges, a cracked teacup painted with roses, its handle long lost. At the bottom, beneath a layer of moth-eaten fabric, was a small knitted baby blanket. A patchwork of pinks and greens, carefully made, the kind of thing a grandmother might have knit on long winter evenings. Carter brushed it off, and as he did, a faint sound fluttered through the air. At first he thought it was just the wind or a shift in the old house, but then it came again, a soft, muffled whimper, so quiet he might have missed it if Rowan hadn't suddenly gone rigid, every muscle tense. The dog's ears pricked forward, his eyes searching the dim corners of the storeroom, body coiled as if poised for flight or rescue. Carter stilled his breath and listened. The sound, so small, so easy to overlook, rose again, threading itself between the clutter and the silence. It was the kind of cry he remembered from childhood nights, the way his little brother, scared by a storm, would stifle his fear, hoping not to wake anyone. The way Carter himself had sometimes cried after the fire, pressing his face to a pillow, wishing someone would hear. Rowan whined, pushing his head toward the back wall of the crate, sniffing insistently at a seam between two warped planks. Carter leaned closer, pressing his ear to the wood. For a moment, there was nothing. Then, unmistakably, a shuddering breath and the quietest of sobs, a sound so raw it made Carter's throat tighten in response. He tried to steady his voice, speaking softly into the darkness, as if addressing both the room and the ache in his own chest. "It's okay," he said, words nearly lost in the gloom. "We're here. You're not alone." There was no answer, but the crying didn't stop. It came in irregular waves, sometimes a gasp, sometimes just the wet hiccup of fear held too long. Carter's hands moved instinctively, probing the edges of the crate. He found a loose board, old nails rusted and nearly gone. With a gentle push, he shifted it aside, revealing a hollow space behind the crate, no bigger than a cupboard, layered with dust and the ghosts of old secrets. Inside, tucked into the very corner, was a small bundle, a child's scarf, a doll with her hair tangled around her porcelain neck, and another piece of paper, folded and damp. Carter unfolded it carefully, eyes adjusting to the shaky scrawl. "I'm sorry. I didn't mean to hide. Please come back. Emily." His vision blurred, the words trembling on the paper as if they were still alive. Rowan rested his head on Carter's knee, grounding him, as if to say, "I hear it too." Carter took a long, steady breath, feeling the weight of what they'd found. This sorrow left behind, this longing to be seen. He gathered the blanket, the note, the shoe, and cradled them gently, as if afraid to disturb whatever fragile hope might still be lingering there. He sat for a moment in the hush, the only sound the faint, fading echo of a child's quiet cry. It was not a call for help that could be answered all at once. It was the sound of absence, of someone waiting for rescue, or maybe just to be remembered. Outside, the rain had stopped, and the clouds began to thin. The dust motes in the storeroom danced in the pale shaft of light from the half-open door. Carter rose, Rowan close behind, both of them changed in some small, invisible way. Carter finds a sorrowful note and traces of Emily, her name on a shoe, a blanket, and a message of regret, hidden behind the crate, as a stifled cry lingers in the quiet storeroom air. Who is Emily? And how did her childhood sorrow become woven into the fabric of this forgotten place? The town of Sandpoint seemed to hold its breath as Carter stepped out of the antique shop, arms full of objects that felt heavier than their small weight could explain. Rowan trotted at his side, eyes bright but wary, as if still listening for that small, hidden crawl. The rain had cleared, leaving the streets slick and shining, the maple leaves pressed to the pavement in mosaic patterns of gold and rust. Carter laid the scarf, blanket, shoe, and Emily's note on the front seat of the cruiser. He sat for a moment with the door open, breathing in the chill air. Rowan hopped into the passenger side and settled in, nose resting on the edge of the seat, eyes never leaving Carter's face. He pulled his notebook from the glove compartment, flipping back through pages already thick with ink, notes from routine calls, sketches of faces half-remembered, stray thoughts about his father and brother that he'd never learned how to say out loud. Now a new entry. Emily, missing, small shoes, quiet cry. Please come back. He closed his eyes and let his mind wander backward, tracing the edges of the story. 7 years ago, on a night thick with the scent of smoke and burning leaves, a girl named Emily had vanished from her house on Maple Avenue. She'd been just 6 years old, last seen playing with dolls in the upstairs window as dusk fell. No broken windows, no signs of struggle, just the memory of a light going out, a bed left cold. Carter drove slowly toward the old part of town, Rowan upright in the seat, watching the world slide past. The houses here leaned into the wind, siding peeling, porches sagging under the weight of untold seasons. He parked outside the address from the file. Emily's house, abandoned for years. The front steps now choked with weeds and stray toys sun-bleached and half-buried in the yard. The chain-link fence creaked as Carter let himself in. Rowan hesitated, ears flat, before slipping through the gap and padding ahead. The grass was tall and wild, hiding the bones of a tricycle, a faded rubber ball, and the shell of a blue plastic sandbox now filled with rainwater and leaves. He moved slowly, careful not to disturb the quiet. Rowan sniffed at the toys, tail lowered, his movements cautious but determined. Carter paused at the foot of the porch, running his fingers over the carved initials in the railing. Tiny names layered over decades, the marks of children trying to make themselves real. He remembered suddenly how his own brother used to etch their names into anything that would hold a scar. Tree trunks, the inside of closet doors, even the bricks by the lake. "Make it so no one can forget us," his brother used to say, voice small but full of certainty. Carter climbed the porch, stepping carefully around a doll with a cracked face and one missing arm. The front door hung slightly open, warped by years of neglect. Inside, the air was thick with the scent of old wood, dust, and something sweeter, a hint of lavender, long faded, clinging stubbornly to the memory of a family that once lived here. He walked through the silent rooms, each step stirring up echoes. The living room still held a battered sofa, the fabric threadbare at the arms. A kitchen chair sat in the corner, a child's sweater draped across the back, forgotten. On the mantel, photographs lay face down, glass cracked, as if someone had tried to erase the past but hadn't the heart to throw it away. Upstairs, Carter paused outside the smallest bedroom. The door was covered in stickers, stars, rainbows, a small dog with floppy ears. He pushed it open gently. The curtains, still pink and faded, hung limp in the weak sunlight. Toys crowded the shelves, plastic horses, puzzle pieces, books with worn spines. On the windowsill, 4 porcelain dolls sat in a row, their dresses matching, faces serene and unreadable. Rowan entered behind him, nose working the air. The dog sniffed along the baseboards, pausing at a gap in the plaster near the window. He let out a low, caw, uncertain whine. Carter knelt, running his fingers into the narrow space. There, hidden in the darkness, he found a tattered handkerchief, embroidered with the letter E, and another scrap of paper. This one read, in childish scrawl, "If you find me, please bring my dog. I miss her. Emily." Carter's heart caught. He closed his eyes and let the ache of the words settle deep. He could imagine Emily, alone in the gathering dark, wishing for the small comfort of fur and breath, the quiet courage of a loyal friend. Downstairs, an elderly neighbor watched from her porch, her hands folded in her lap. Carter crossed over, Rowan at his side. She greeted him with a nod that spoke of years and losses. "She was a sweet child," the woman said, voice trembling, "always talking to her dolls. Some nights, I'd see her through the window, whispering secrets to them, like they were real." Carter nodded, listening as she spoke of the last day, the way the house fell silent, the dolls staring blankly from the glass. "Her mother never stopped waiting," she finished. "I think part of her still does, even now." He thanked her, letting the silence between them stretch. Rowan pressed close, tail brushing Carter's calf, a small, anchoring comfort. As Carter turned to leave, he found a plain envelope tucked under the windshield wiper of his cruiser. No name, only a message inside. "She's still waiting for you." His hand trembled as he folded the note, the weight of unanswered questions pressing heavy on his shoulders. Rowan watched him with steady eyes, patient, hopeful. Carter uncovers Emily's old plea for her lost dog, and receives an anonymous letter. She's still waiting for you. Who is leaving these notes? And is there still hope for a reunion between Emily and the friend she misses most? Rain returned to Sandpoint with a hush and a heaviness that swallowed sound, filling the night with the soft rush of water against window panes and the distant, hollow tap of droplets on tin roofs. The world seemed to contract in the gray wash, houses wrapped in their own small glow, the streets running like narrow rivers of gold and shadow. Carter sat at his kitchen table, the lamplight warm but thin against the gloom, notebook open to a blank page. The day's findings, Emily's name, the missing years, the anonymous letter, had settled inside him like stones in a pond. He wrote nothing, only pressed the pen gently to paper, the weight of questions crowding out words. Rowan paced the living room, his nails clicking softly against the old wooden floor. Every so often, he'd pause at the door, ears lifted to sounds only he could hear, then return to Carter's side, restless, uneasy. The room was heavy with the kind of silence that precedes a storm, thick, expectant, alive. When the clock on the wall chimed 10, Carter rose to close the curtains. That's when Rowan froze, head up, body tense. The wind outside howled, and then, cutting through the storm, a distant sound, thin and strange, like the rattle of glass or the shiver of metal far away. Rowan's head snapped toward the back door, muscles quivering beneath his silver-black coat. Before Carter could call his name, Rowan was already at the door, pawing once, then twice, then letting out a sharp bark that split the quiet. Carter felt a prickle on his arms, a memory of all the nights he'd been awakened by warning barks, by the uncanny sense that some things move through the world unseen but not unfelt. He grabbed his jacket and flashlight and followed Rowan out into the rain. The dog moved quickly, nose to the wind, not hesitating as he crossed the yard and darted into the street. Carter called after him, but Rowan never looked back. The world outside was blurred and soft, streetlights bending in puddles, leaves swirling along the gutters. Carter hurried, breath pluming, shoes splashing cold water. Rowan led him away from the familiar quiet of their street, past the empty post office, the shuttered bakery, and finally, down the gravel lane that edged the lake. At the far end, hunkered beneath drooping birches and half lost to the wildness of their roots, stood the old warehouse, a squat, forgotten place where unwanted things were stored and left to rot. Its windows were black, roof sagging, paint peeling in long strips, but the door gaped open, shuddering in the wind. Rowan didn't wait. He slipped through the opening, tail low, shoulders tense. Carter hesitated only a moment, then followed, the light from his flashlight trembling as he swept it through the gloom. Inside, the air was thick with the smell of wet wood and old fabric. Water dripped from a hole in the roof, pattering onto a pile of broken furniture. Shadows layered the walls in restless heaps. But beneath the rain and silence, Carter caught another sound. A faint, hiccuping sob, so soft it barely rose above the drip and shuffle of the storm. Rowan darted deeper into the warehouse, weaving between stacks of forgotten things. Bicycles with rusted chains, boxes of mildewed books, a rocking horse missing its mane. His nose skimmed the floor, then lifted to the far wall, where a ragged tarp hung loose. Carter followed, heart pounding, feeling the hush press close around him. The closer he came, the clearer the sound became. A child's cry, not loud, but persistent. the way a wound continues to ache long after the initial hurt. Carter knelt, calling softly, "It's all right. I'm here. You're safe." His words seemed to settle the air. The sobbing faded to a hush, then returned, just a little stronger. Rowan sniffed along the wall, then pawed at the concrete near the baseboards, claws scratching at a faint line, a seam in the floor Carter hadn't noticed before. He set the flashlight down and pressed his fingers to the edge of the seam. It shifted slightly, damp and swollen from the rain, but with Rowan's help, he pried it open, a hidden hatch, rough and narrow, leading to darkness below. For a moment, Carter hesitated, feeling the chill of air that rushed up from the darkness, tinged with the scent of earth and old, locked-in secrets. He reached for Rowan, steadying himself, then leaned in, his voice low and gentle. "Is someone down there?" he called. The answer came as a faint whimper, then the unmistakable sound of someone, moving in the gloom. Carter shone the flashlight down the opening. Dust danced in the beam, swirling around the outline of a small, trembling figure. He reached out his hand, as if the gesture alone might bridge the gap between fear and hope, memory and present. Rowan pressed close, his warmth a quiet comfort against the cold. The rain outside hammered harder, as if urging them to hurry. But inside the warehouse, time seemed to slow, each heartbeat, each breath, another step toward the answer that had haunted their days and nights. Deep in the warehouse, Rowan uncovers a hidden trapdoor. From below, the sound of a stifled child's sob rises. Who is waiting in the darkness? And will Carter and Rowan reach them in time before the secrets of the storm swallow them again? The warehouse was a cathedral of shadows. The only light, Carter's trembling flashlight beam, and the muted shimmer of rainwater running down the walls. The hatch in the floor gaped open, the smell of earth and old metal rising from its dark throat. Carter's knees ached as he crouched, heart heavy with fear and hope in equal measure. Rowan pressed close, his breath a warm ghost in the cold, as if reassuring Carter that they weren't alone. Not in this moment, not with the storm pounding overhead, not with the ache of every unspoken memory crowding the silence. He called again, softly this time, the words almost prayerful. "You're safe. I'm here to help." Below, something shifted, a shiver in the darkness, a sound too small to belong to anything but a child. Carter angled the flashlight, its weak light trembling across a dirt floor and piles of broken crates. Then it caught. A pale hand, small fingers curled tightly around the edge of an old blanket, knuckles shining blue-white in the gloom. Rowan let out a quiet whine, not of fear, but of longing, a note so human it made Carter's eyes burn. He reached into the hatch, his own hand open and steady. "Come on, sweetheart. We'll get you home." For a moment, nothing happened. The hand hesitated, fingers loosening, then retreating into shadow. The rain drummed harder on the roof, the wind rattling the bones of the building. Carter waited, breath shallow, refusing to let the urgency in his heart rush the silence that filled the hidden room. Finally, a shape crept forward, slow, shuffling, wary. A little girl, her hair tangled and streaked with dust, her face smudged with dirt, and something older, harder to name. She wore a faded blue dress, its hem torn and crusted with mud, a cardigan drooping from one thin shoulder. Around her neck, knotted tightly, was a piece of pink yarn, a scrap of the blanket Carter had found days ago in the storeroom, now worn like a talisman. She did not cry or call out. She simply looked up, her eyes impossibly wide and dark, and in them Carter saw not only fear, but something older, longing, hope, the unyielding ache of waiting too long for someone to answer. He knelt at the edge of the hatch, extending his arms. "It's all right. I've got you." The girl hesitated, then, as if her strength simply broke, reached up. Her hand was cold and trembling. Carter wrapped his fingers gently around hers and drew her up into the light. She was lighter than he'd expected, fragile as a paper doll. She pressed close to his chest, head tucked beneath his chin, and for a moment, she was so still he wondered if she'd ever move again. Rowan, tail lowered, stepped close and sniffed her hand. She flinched at first, but then slowly, shyly, let her fingers curl into his fur. The connection seemed to ground her. She closed her eyes, lips trembling, and leaned against him. The rain outside softened for just a heartbeat, as if the world itself was holding its breath. Carter felt the world shift. He rocked her gently, speaking in low, steady tones. "You're all right. I promise no one's going to hurt you here." She did not answer, but she did not pull away. When Carter looked down, he saw a faded patch sewn to her cardigan, a crooked letter E, the same hand as the notes in the shop and the house, the name he had written and rewritten in his notebook, chasing it through the lonely corners of town. He cradled her close, his hand shaking only a little as he reached for the flashlight and shone it once more into the hatch. There was nothing else, no other sound, no shadow that moved, just dust and memories and the echo of her crying, still clinging to the boards. Outside the storm raged, but inside something softer had taken hold. A hush, a pause, the quiet grace of arrival. Carter rose with the girl in his arms, Rowan leading the way to the door. The world beyond the warehouse felt sharper, lights brighter, rain cleaner, the air almost sweet. The girl shivered, but when Carter set her down on the passenger seat, she let Rowan curl against her, his warm flank a shield against everything cold and lost. In the rearview mirror, Carter caught his own eyes, red-rimmed and weary, but shining with a fierce, gentle hope. He didn't press the girl for words. Instead, he let the silence stand, let her breathing and Rowan's steady presence fill the car. Sometimes he knew rescue was just showing up and not leaving. Sometimes it was listening for the small voice in the dark and waiting long enough for it to trust the light. He drove through the night, headlights sweeping gold over the wet road. The little girl held safe at last, not by answers, but by the warmth of two living, breathing hearts beside her. The girl, wearing Emily's patch, is found alive and silent in the darkness. She clings to Carter and Rowan as if they are the answer to a wish long made and almost forgotten. Why did Emily never call out before? And what loneliness kept her hidden in the shadows for so long? At dawn, the world outside Sandpoint Police Station was gray and trembling, dew purling on the grass, the lake hidden beneath a low-lying fog. The night storm had washed the streets clean, but left the air thick with that peculiar hush that follows sorrow. The sense that something sacred has passed through, and for once left something whole in its wake. Inside, the station's lights were soft and yellow, spilling quietly across battered desks and old bulletin boards covered in missing posters, community notices, faded newspaper clippings. Carter sat in the break room, exhaustion weighing down every muscle, but he didn't let himself drift. He held Emily close in the old armchair, wrapped in a blanket, her head resting lightly on his chest. Rowan dozed at their feet, his breathing deep and steady. One paw curled protectively against the hem of Emily's cardigan. Emily hadn't spoken a word since Carter had lifted her from the darkness of the warehouse. She stared at the walls with a solemn, searching gaze, eyes wide and unblinking, as if still listening for some distant echo. She let herself be held, but her body was stiff at first, a tension born not just from fear, but from the practice of hiding, of holding herself small for so long. Carter understood something of that. He'd spent years keeping his own wounds folded up tight, his sorrow pressed flat between the pages of old notebooks and the hush of empty nights. Now, as he watched the girl shiver and slowly, haltingly, lean into his warmth, he felt an ache in his chest. A mixture of pride, sorrow, and the beginning of something like forgiveness. For her. For himself. A nurse from the local clinic came in, her voice gentle as rain, checking Emily's pulse, murmuring reassurances. Carter let her work, grateful for another pair of caring hands in the small, quiet station. When she finished, she crouched beside Emily and offered a cup of cocoa, but Emily only looked at it, then down at Rowan, as if weighing whether the world outside her silence could be trusted. It was Rowan who broke through first. He lifted his head, nosed her hand, then nudged her gently with his muzzle. She blinked, once, twice, and then, with a hesitance that made Carter's throat tighten, she reached out and let her fingers tangle deep in the dog's fur. Rowan whined softly, then rolled to his side, offering his belly in the universal language of trust. Emily's mouth quivered at the corners, the smallest flicker of a smile, a hope so fragile it seemed to shimmer and fade all at once. There were bruises on Emily's wrists, faint and old, and a line of red marks around her cuffs. Signs of restraint, perhaps, or simply the marks of being too long alone. Carter noticed them, but said nothing, only wrapped the blanket tighter and let her rest, his hand steady and silent at her back. The door to the station creaked open, letting in a rush of cool air and the slow shuffle of footsteps. A woman stood in the threshold, shoulders bowed, hair silvered and wild, eyes rimmed red from years of grieving. It was Emily's mother, a woman remade by loss, her face carved with lines of waiting and hope. She saw Emily, and for a moment, the world held its breath. She crossed the floor in a stumbling rush, falling to her knees before the chair, hands trembling as she reached for her daughter. "Emily, oh baby, oh, I thought—" Her words broke into tears, soft and fierce. Emily did not move at first, but then, slow as spring thaw, she lifted her arms and let herself be gathered in. She clung to her mother's neck, face buried in the woman's sweater, and Carter felt a shudder move through them both. Emily's mother rocked her gently, tears wetting the girl's tangled hair, her words spilling out in a river of apology and wonder. Carter turned away, letting them have their privacy. He found Rowan beside him, tail thumping softly, eyes shining. In the quiet, Carter knelt, pressing his forehead to Rowan's, feeling gratitude deeper than language. A social worker offered Emily paper and crayons, and for the first time she took them. Her small hand moved slowly, sketching a room full of dolls, a window, and standing outside, a dog with a wide back and gentle eyes. She colored the dog's ear silver, then pressed the page into Carter's palm, looking up at him with a question she could not voice. He smiled, a tremor in his throat, and nodded. Yes, he found you. He always would. Outside, the lake brightened, sun breaking through the last shreds of fog. In that fragile morning, forgiveness began, not as a grand pronouncement, but as a series of small gestures, a touch, a drawing, a wordless understanding that grief can be held and healed and passed down as a kind of legacy. Emily draws the room of dolls and a German shepherd waiting at her window, the dog she'd wished for, the friend who finally found her. Was it chance or something deeper that led Rowan to Emily? Does forgiveness move through us, generation by generation, even when we cannot find the words? The last of autumn's leaves drifted through Sandpoint, swirling over the police station's stoop, collecting in small golden piles along the curb. The rain was gone, and the air tasted of wood smoke and lake water, a clear, fragile morning after so many days of ache and search. The world felt new, or at least as if it were trying to remember how to begin again. On the broad front porch of the station, Carter, Rowan, and Emily sat together on the old wooden bench beneath the overhang, wrapped in the hush of things too big for words. The lake shone silver and blue in the distance. Sunlight warmed the pine boards at their feet. Somewhere nearby, the slow ticking of the station clock counted out the minutes, each one easier than the last. Emily was bundled in her mother's old coat, legs tucked beneath her, hair brushed and clean. She leaned against Rowan, her cheek pressed to the dog's soft ruff. Rowan sat with perfect patience, broad head resting gently on her shoulder, his eyes half closed in the way of a creature who knows his work is done for now, and all that remains is to bear witness. Carter sat at the other end of the bench, elbows on knees, notebook open in his lap, though he hadn't written a word since sunrise. None of them spoke. There was no need. Their silence was the gentle, healing kind, the sort that wraps around bruised hearts, smoothing the sharp edges, letting breath and hope move quietly through. Carter watched Emily out of the corner of his eye, the way she traced invisible shapes on Rowan's fur, the way her lips moved sometimes in silent conversation with the dog. He remembered a line from his notebook. Not all miracles are loud. Some come on quiet feet and simply sit beside you until the world is gentle again. He thought of his father, how he used to say that healing was mostly about showing up, staying in the hard places, not rushing the silence. Carter realized, with a pang both sweet and painful, that he was learning the same lesson all over again. You cannot fix what's broken by force of will or cleverness. Sometimes, all you can do is stay. A few townsfolk passed by on their morning walks, nodding, offering a wave, some pausing a little longer, hope shining in their faces as they saw the small circle of warmth on the porch. The news of Emily's rescue had begun to trickle through the town, not in headlines or grand announcements, but in low voices at the cafe, in the way people smiled more softly at one another, in the slow, careful return of laughter to places where it had long been missing. Emily's mother came to the door with 2 mugs of cocoa, setting them gently on the railing before retreating again, letting the moment be. Carter took one, passed the other to Emily, who cradled it in her small hands, eyes shining with tired joy. She did not drink, only held it, letting the warmth seep into her skin. Time passed. Not quickly, not slowly. Just enough. The sun climbed, glinting off the lake, catching in Rowan's silvered furmos. Emily laid her hand on the dog's scarred ear, then on Carter's knee. The contact was light, a question, a promise. I'm still here. I'm not lost. Carter closed his notebook, setting it aside. He found himself watching the world the way he had as a boy, without expectation, simply curious, quietly grateful for the ordinary miracle of being allowed to remain. Across the street, the old Maple and Sons antique shop stood in shadow, its windows full of porcelain dolls. Rowan's gaze drifted toward it, ears lifting, head tilting just so, as if he heard something still unfinished whispering from within. The moment passed, but the question lingered in the air. What stories remain, half buried in the quiet corners of this town, waiting for someone to listen? Emily sighed, content. Rowan nuzzled her, and Carter, for once, did not feel the need to move, to solve, to chase what might still be missing. He was content to sit, here, now, in the small warmth they made together. He thought of all the things that could save a life: a cup of cocoa, a gentle dog, a neighbor's quiet courage, the decision to stay. As the morning settled around them, Carter let himself believe, just for a moment, that nothing was truly lost, only waiting to be found by someone willing to linger, to love, to listen. Even as Rowan's gaze lingers on the shadowed window of the antique shop, there is a sense that not all mysteries are solved, not all sadness erased. What else waits in the quiet rooms behind old doors? Whose voices remain unheard, and who will stay to hear them? Sometimes, all it takes is a patient heart, a loyal dog, and a willingness to listen for the small voices lost beneath the noise of everyday life. In the hush that follows heartbreak, kindness becomes a kind of shelter, the gentle hand, the quiet presence, the simple act of staying beside someone who needs to be found. We all carry hidden sorrows, just as we carry hope. Sometimes it's in a child's drawing, a dog's steady gaze, or the warmth of a morning that feels new again. And maybe that's the gift, knowing that none of us has to find our way alone. What moments of healing or quiet courage have shaped your own life? Have you ever experienced the miracle of being found, or of finding someone who needed you, even in a small way? If this story touched you, I invite you to share your thoughts or a memory in the comments. Your voice might be the light someone else needs today. Thank you for being here, and for believing in the quiet power of love, loyalty, and second chances.